Welcome back to ESCAP's e-learning series on public-private partnerships. In this module, we'll guide you through the key steps required to develop a PPP program. The primary questions we'll address are: how can governments best facilitate the development of PPP projects? And what can governments do to foster a PPP enabling environment? As a government, there are 4 primary steps you can take to establish an environment favourable to PPP development. First, you will need to define how you are planning to use PPP solutions for infrastructure development by formulating a clear policy. Second, you need to confirm that the applicable legal and regulatory frameworks are compatible with PPPs. Third, you will need to ensure that the relevant institutions are capable of supporting the implementation of a PPP program. And fourth, you need sufficient resources to finance the preparation of PPP projects and make them attractive to private partners. Let's have a look at each of these 4 elements in more detail. The first step concerns policy formation. It's important that the government develops a vision and a strategy for using PPPs as a means to deliver public infrastructure services. The vision and strategy should address issues such as: what are the objectives of the PPP program? Which sectors are targeted? What types of PPP are envisioned? And how does the government plan to implement strategy? This can take different forms. For instance, a policy document can be adopted, or a dedicated PPP law can be enacted. The overall principles remain the same, regardless of how the strategy is formulated. The development of an official PPP policy can also help to secure high-level political support. Such support is needed due to the sensitive nature of PPP projects. For instance, public opinion can be easily persuaded to the belief that too much favour is given to the private sector, which in turn can cause public authorities to question their commitment to a PPP project. Political support is most often the primary roadblock to the successful completion of PPP transactions, and nobody wants to work on a project for years only to see a government policy change and remove its support in the middle of a process. To prevent this from happening, you need strong, consistent, and stable support from top policymakers. Support from senior politicians is also required to build consensus among different ministries and agencies, and to address internal resistance. For many government officials, the PPP is a new procurement method requiring complex arrangements, and they may be uncertain of their role in the whole process. Without internal buy-in, there's a risk that government officials may stay in their comfort zone and only submit projects which are not feasible via traditional procurement for PPP implementation, therefore condemning the PPP program to failure. An official PPP policy can also send a clear message to the private sector about the government's intention to develop a pipeline of PPP projects. Entering a new market can be costly for foreign companies, and they will only make an investment if they see the possibility of a long-term involvement. If they're not selected for the first PPP project, investors want to know there will be additional business opportunities in the future. A pipeline of projects needs to be well prepared in order to be credible, rather than a long list unlikely to happen. It's the establishment of a track record that will ultimately convince investors of the viability of PPPs in a country. Starting with the easiest projects, those that are most likely to be successful in a good strategy to progressively build a convincing track record. The second important factor in establishing a pro-PPP environment involves the compatibility of legal and regulatory frameworks. To attract private investors, legislation might need to be adjusted to make private sector involvement possible. If there is a clear legal basis defining who is the competent authority to approve PPP projects and to sign PPP contracts, is private involvement authorised for all these sectors? Some countries only allow PPPs for economic infrastructure, like transport and energy, while others allow PPPs in all sectors, including social sectors like health and education. Are there any limits to foreign investment in infrastructure? These are important questions, as no one wants the legality of a PPP contract to be called into question. If the legal framework is not strong enough, then parties willing to terminate a PPP contract might be tempted to use legal arguments to exit the transaction. For example, it might be tempting for a new government to renege on a contract that was approved by a former government if it disagrees with the approach chosen. Another issue regarding regulatory frameworks concerns whether procurement rules are adequate for PPPs. Are conditions in place that establish a fair, transparent, and competitive bidding process? The private sector will not participate in a procurement process that is perceived to be biased, and the government will not achieve the best outcome if there is not enough competition. Adjustments to public procurement rules may be required. Due to the inherent complexity of PPP projects, interaction between the public authority and the private partners during the procurement process might be necessary in order to refine a project specification. Procurement rules must also clarify whether projects proposed directly by the private sector, also known as unsolicited proposals, are acceptable. Dispute resolution mechanisms should also be in place to deal with the differences that will inevitably arise between the public and private partners during the life of a 20-year contract. Before entering into such long-term contracts, the private sector will require mechanisms be in place to guarantee its rights are protected. In this respect, arbitration is often preferred to in-court procedures because it's perceived to be quicker and more independent from political interference. Another key consideration is the regulation of tariffs. For instance, if a private operator is authorized to collect fees from users, how are such fees set? Are there any limits? How is the price adjusted over time? Some of these questions can be addressed in the contract, though sector regulations will often be necessary to establish clear methodologies for tariff setting and review. Private investors pay close attention to this consideration as it can greatly impact project profitability. A third important element of PPP enabling environments regards adequate institutional arrangements. A clear allocation of responsibility is required to implement a policy. Who is approving what and when? Who is in charge of promoting the PPP solution? Who will be taking care of monitoring and regulation during the implementation of a PPP project? Government officials should also have the capacity to implement PPP projects and the possibility to access the required expertise. Some governments have established PPP units to provide the necessary institutional support. The functions typically assigned to these units can be divided into three broad categories: supervision, facilitation, and promotion. Starting with supervision, the PPP unit can be assigned the role of screening project proposals submitted by government's contracting agencies to assess whether these projects are suitable for PPP implementation. To be effective in their screening roles, PPP units need to be involved in the approval processes of PPP projects. To this end, these PPP units are usually involved in advising approval committees at different stages, for instance, before the feasibility studies, the launch of bidding documents, or the signature of the PPP contract. Some monitoring tasks can also be delegated to the PPP unit. For example, to check if the PPP program is meeting its objectives. The second function of PPP units is the facilitation of PPP projects. PPP units can provide technical support to government contracting agencies in identifying PPP opportunities and for developing PPP projects. For example, to draft a business case or to prepare bidding documents. PPP units can also facilitate coordination among government agencies involved in the development of a project, which can be a long, long list, often including line ministries, planning ministries, ministries of finance, environment departments, law ministries, and so on and so on. To provide this technical support, PPP units often rely on external expertise and appoint transaction advisors for this purpose. PPP units also facilitate transactions by developing standardized procedures and documents that reduce transaction costs. For instance, material can be developed to help government officials in dealing with specific issues like risk allocation or project screening, or any other relevant issues for PPP. Bidding documents and contracts can also be standardized. For example, some countries have been successful in developing model concession agreements, which are ready-to-use contracts. Because the contract provisions are well known by all stakeholders, including lenders, the negotiation process is accelerated. The third function of PPP units is to promote the use of PPPs within a country. To do this, PPP units support the development of well-prepared pipelines of projects that can be marketed to investors. Such marketing can be done through publications and online platforms that provide information on upcoming projects. PPP units can also serve as entry points for investors that want to learn more about infrastructure projects in a country. PPP units can also promote PPP solutions internally through raising awareness among government officials of the potential of PPPs as procurement mechanisms and supporting capacity building projects. For example, PPP units can be involved in administering training programs to build the capacity of government officials to develop and implement PPP projects. Managing the public perception of PPPs is important because you don't want to have your PPP program facing strong public opposition. A PPP unit can help manage such perception by providing information to the public on the benefits of involving the private sector in public infrastructure delivery. PPP units can also arrange consultations for PPP projects to address stakeholder concerns. Now that we've reviewed the various functions of PPP units, the question is where to locate them. There is generally no established rule in this regard, as PPP units can be based independently from the government, in government ministries, or even at the subnational levels. It depends on the organisation of each government. PPP units are often located close to the Ministry of Finance due to those budgetary implications of PPP projects. One issue that may arise is the potential for conflicts of interest if the same institution is in charge of both promoting a PPP and assessing the overall performance of the PPP program. To prevent this conflict, it may be necessary to allocate assessment responsibilities to another institution, like a national audit office. Additionally, it's important to consider the PPP units are not objectives in themselves, and other institutional arrangements are possible. In some cases, establishing a dedicated PPP unit might not be financially sustainable. Staff in PPP units have not enough projects to work on if the anticipated deal flow is very low. The last important aspect of a PPP enabling environment involves financial support mechanisms. To develop a PPP program, you first need money to prepare projects. Some countries have established project development facilities for this purpose. These facilities recruit consultants in order to access expertise not available internally. Consultants might be legal advisors recruited to draft the PPP contract, technical advisors recruited to develop project specifications, or financial advisors recruited to evaluate financial proposals received from the bidders. By establishing dedicated facilities like these, governments ensure resources can be quickly mobilized and are not dependent on the yearly national budget cycle. Revolving mechanisms must be created to ensure the replenishment of these facilities. To this end, development costs are received from the winning bidder in some countries. Additional support may be required to ensure a project is financially attractive. Tax exemptions or reduced import duties can be granted. Guarantees can be provided to cover risks that the private partner is not ready to take on. The government might also decide to cover partial project costs through what's called Viability Gap Funding. Take a railway project, for example. The project's economic benefits might include a reduced travel time, reduced user costs, and a lower pollution level. These economic benefits might exceed the associated economic costs, which makes the project economically viable and desirable. The project might, however, not be financially feasible because they lack the ability to raise the requisite revenues to cover project costs. Viability gap funding mechanisms fill the gap necessary to make these projects financially viable. Some of these financial support mechanisms may create liabilities for governments in the long run, and there is a clear need to closely monitor the impact of these mechanisms on public finance. Other factors may influence the success of a PPP program, such as the economic and business climate of a country. For instance, PPP project viability depends on the overall macroeconomic environment. Is there a labour force qualified to run the type of infrastructure envisaged? Is the customer base large enough to pay for the infrastructure? Will the economic activity create demand for additional infrastructure? All these factors will influence the business case and the viability of a PPP project. The state of local financial sector will also determine whether the private sector can easily access financing for projects. PPP projects are long-term by definition, and long-term funding is not always available. Private investors will be more likely to invest in a country where the business climate is favourable. For example, in countries where establishing a new company is relatively easy. That concludes the third module of ESCAP's e-learning series on public-private partnerships. Thank you for watching and your interest in ESCAP's work. Please check out the ESCAP's website for more information and additional resources on PPPs at www.unescap.org.